Hello, everyone. Chris Gantt-Sorenson with HSB Law Firm. Very excited to be here with everybody today. We have a very special guest speaker, Jamie Fivecoat, who is retired from Michelin and is an executive that is going to be able to answer all of your questions that you have in an HR capacity or otherwise in regards to transitioning and transgender. And so we'll go ahead and slide through and I can talk a little bit more about Jamie. Just remember, if you've got questions, we want you to drop them in the chat box. We'll be answering them either live or in the chat box. Remember that we have credits, SHRM, HRCI, and CLE, and you just make sure that we have the information we need. Brittany will handle that. She's with marketing and she's on, and thank goodness she does these with us, or they wouldn't go nearly as smoothly as they should, and that includes getting your credits. And keep up with our blogs. We won't have a webinar in July, but we'll pick back up in August, and we hope we'll continue to have you join us. As we all start returning to in-person, we want to hear what you think. Do you want to keep it in this format? Is this more convenient? Would you rather have in-person? Let us hear from you on that. And so to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about Jamie. Jamie, as the blog announcement indicated, was with Michelin North America for 38 years, and she had a number of human resources roles through the years. She ended in the Pension and Health Welfare Plan Administration. And so we're talking to someone who worked in your wheelhouse. We're talking to someone who is an HR professional like you. We're also talking to someone who's talking to you and understands the context of the employer's view, the employer's angle in regards to human resources issue. And then we have someone who also sat in the seat of an employee who was transitioning and how that went at the workplace. If you ever had questions about how to address any question or any issue in regards to an employee transitioning in your workplace, if you don't ask them today, I don't know what to say. That is why Jamie is here. Jamie is open to any question. When I give presentations about LGBTQIA and I talk about transitioning, I get so many questions from employers. I am not in nearly the type of position to answer them that Jamie is. And so I really want you guys, while I'm doing my little boring legal bit about the law around these issues, to be thinking about all the things you've wondered about when you have had somebody transitioning. And what's great about this is Jamie's safe. Number one, she's not your employee, and this is a safe space. Number two, we don't keep up with this stuff. So whatever you ask here is not going to show up in some deposition or some EEOC charge later. Jamie wants you to ask questions. All right. So this is the rest of Jamie's career. I mean, obviously 38 years at Michelin and making it all the way to the top in the exec position and being in charge of the employee welfare benefit and employee health and welfare plans. There's not a lot more to say, but Jamie is also such an advocate for transitioning and the LGBTQ plus community. She is the chair of 864 Pride. She's the director and secretary for Upstate Pride out South Carolina, and she works with the Upstate LGBTQIA Chamber of Commerce. And so you can see she's got a lot of experience that she is now exercising in a volunteer capacity after enjoying an illustrious career. And of course, educated with an MBA at Kent State University. And then she went and she got her bachelor's at Bowling Green State University in Kentucky, right, Jamie? Is that in Kentucky? Bowling Green?
Oh, it's Bowling Green's in Ohio.
Oh, sorry. I've been to Bowling Green.
Just south of Toledo.
Oh, there's two Bowling Greens. But anyway, so she has a number of resources available that she's going to talk to you about. She's glad to come and speak. She's glad to, she was who the LGBTQ plus chamber recommended as a speaker. She's done TED Talks. There's a great TED Talk you can watch that she's done. I mean, this is someone who, if you're going to need to have not only questions answered, but giving training, she's absolutely who you should call. So with that, I'll get started. So LGBTQ plus discrimination post-Bostock. First, let's talk about what it was prior to that. 1964, sex always has been a part of Title VII, and that was passed in 1964. The dispute came from folks who defined sex very narrowly, generally as biological sex. there are many of us who always thought sex meant sex. Sex and gender preference and gender identity and any sort of issue associated with sex should not have anything to do with what kind of job an employee is doing, what kind of employment benefits they're entitled to. So there was always this dispute. But even before Bostock was answering the question, the Supreme Court had answered the question, and our own Fourth Circuit in regards to and students, high school age students, answered the question too, that biological sex, Title VII was never meant to be limited to biological sex, and that biological sex is too narrow of a term, that sex is defined broadly. And when we're talking about in the context, particularly of employment, it really has no place in any sort of employment decisions. It includes harassment, discrimination, everything. So let's pop to a Supreme Court history prior to Bostock. Next slide. Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins was a 1989 opinion, and this was, I believe, an employee in the audit division of the company. And she kept seeing other employees advance to partner quicker than her, even though her numbers, her metrics were better. She was a lesbian, and she was open about her sexual preference. And ultimately, this case, SCOTUS agreed that this was evidence. She had presented a sufficient amount of evidence to suggest that she was being subject to sex discrimination in employment in violation of Title VII. And so that case was remanded for consideration of the factual basis of her claims. Initially, it had been dismissed because the court below had decided sex does not include lesbianism. Well, the Supreme Court disagreed in 1989. Oh, somebody said, scoot back. My head is at the top of the cut. I just didn't want you to see my bad hairstyle. Sorry, I've scooted back. Let's hope I can still read my slides. I'm challenged with my eyes. Sorry, and thank you. All right, now the next case that came from SCOTUS was 1998, about 10 years later. And in Oncology, and y'all all probably know about that, same-sex harassment violates Title VII. So this was another step where our Supreme Court was saying, look, sex is not just biological sex. Sex also means sex any way you can interpret it. And in this case, particularly the holding was there can be same-sex harassment in violation of Title VII. I'm hoping this fixed it. All right, next slide. So then we're up to Bostock, which was 2020. That was 3 combined cases. 2 of them were in regards to 2 employees who were gay, who said that they were discriminated against and harassed on the basis of their sexual preference. One of them was a transgender employee. This was an employee who worked for a funeral home. And when the employee was hired, the employee presented as male and wore male business suits, the whole like. The employee during employment came into the employer dressed as a female in a female business suit and said, I identify as female. I wish to be called a female name, and used female pronouns. And this is how I'm going to address going forward. And they fired her. So those were the 3 cases that were before Bostock. And Bostock, the Supreme Court 2020 concluded Title VII protects employees from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So the question is resolved now, it's answered. And although a lot of people thought employees were not protected prior to pre-Bostock in most states, if you had already argued that court in our jurisdiction, that case in our jurisdiction, the Fourth Circuit would have probably disagreed in light of the opinion that they wrote in regards to the student under Title IX. On the same issue. And that student actually was a transgender student who wanted to use the restroom of the gender that he identified with rather than biological. And the Fourth Circuit agreed that that should be permissible under Title IX. All right, so that's what SCOTUS is going to do. That's what the Fourth Circuit is going to do. That matters to us because if you find yourself with an EEOC charge on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination, the EEOC charge, if it doesn't resolve, then you get suit gets filed in federal court in our jurisdiction. That's when somebody like me gets involved, and I'll be telling you, look, this is what I think is going to be how this court rules, because none of our federal courts want to be overruled by the Fourth Circuit, and they're going to follow Fourth Circuit precedent. And so we have enough precedent in this jurisdiction, not to mention Bostock, that indicates that this is something that is going to be applied in the law there. And so it's got to filter down into how we deal with our employees. And most of you on this call, on this Zoom presentation know that. Next slide. All right, so in Bostock, the court said gender identity, sexual orientation falls under the definition of sex. And it defined it very broadly: non-binary, homosexual, heterosexual, transgender. If it has anything to do with sex, any aspect of sex, it is going to apply. And of course, from an employment standpoint, that should be easy because those things shouldn't be factoring into whether someone can do a job well or not. Next slide. So then we get to the EOC. Well, the EOC's position has always been that this was a protected status. And so even before Bostock, it's taken the position that sexual orientation and gender identity are absolutely areas that fall under their protection. Something that I hear a lot is, well, the customer prefers, or a lot of folks are in retirement home clients, and the retirement home client is, elder and maybe not, as aware, and they prefer the same rules that apply to vendors and any third parties on your workplace in regards to gender, race, any sort of discrimination, harassment apply to these categories. And so if you have any sort of situation where your customer is engaging in conduct that violates Title VII, you've got to protect your employee. All right, and then the other thing the EOC says is the restroom. Transgender employee must use the restroom that they identify with, and it's against the law to require them to use the restroom of their biological sex. Oddly enough, this is the one I get the most questions about, is the restroom. So let's pop to the next slide. So this is the American with Disabilities Act. You can tell I'm hitting all the laws so that you know what the laws are. Now, ADA is an interesting act because unlike the EEOC or the other laws that we're talking about today, its definition in regards to disability specifically excludes any sort of condition that is related to gender identity or gender transition issues. And particularly if you look at the bolded language from the actual American with Disabilities Act statute, look where they've grouped transsexualism. They've grouped it with other things that are crimes: pedophilia, exhibitionism, voyeurism. And then, they call it gender identity disorders, sexual behavior disorders. I mean, this is a statute that is behind the times. That's behind the times. But what you've got to remember about the ADA is the ADA is interpreted by the EEOC. Well, we already know how the EEOC feels about it because we just covered that. Plus, there is a federal case that disregarded how the ADA defined this. And if we could pop to the next slide, I'll tell you about that one. Well, apparently I won't. I go back and forth. Pop to the next slide, Brittany, and then we'll pop one back once we cover it. Blott versus Cabela's Retail. This was an employee that worked at Cabela's in Pennsylvania, and she was biological gender male, but identified female. They would not use the proper pronouns. They would not permit restroom use. They would not give her a name tag, all right, that she wanted for her uniform. And the federal court, which is applying the same law that would apply here, said that the ADA provision excluding gender identity disorder did not protect any claim of disability on the basis of gender dysphoria, that gender dysphoria surely would be considered a disability. And this was an employee who developed extreme psychological issues associated with how she was treated at work. So now, Brittany, pop back to the slide before. The court also relied on the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. So the DSM is, as y'all know, something that doctors use where they outline specific recognized disorders. And gender dysmorphia is considered a condition that is a medical and a physical condition and a mental condition, and one that justifies treatment, and therefore one that would be considered a disability if you had an employee with it. So why is this important? Why is Chris up here talking to us about this? It's important because you cannot rely on the ADA to say that gender dysphoria or any sort of disabilities associated with gender identity are not going to be considered disabilities. And the Block case in Pennsylvania, while it was not in our jurisdiction, is based on the same law that it would be based on here. And it also gives you an idea of what the courts are doing and what the agencies are doing that would be considering any claims that are put before them in regards to employers and healthcare plans. Next slide. And then the following slide. Keep going. One more. All right, so the EEOC also issued transgender opinions, and if you look at the dates of these were all a good while ago and long before any of these, most recent cases. So an employee cannot be denied access to the restroom that they identify with. Intentional misuse of a transgender employee's name or pronoun is going to constitute sex harassment and discrimination. An employer's failure to revise its records pursuant to changes in identity and gender identity is going to present a valid discrimination and harassment claim. And allegations of a gender identity and transgender discrimination necessarily involve sex discrimination. So we know what the EEOC is going to do if they're faced with an EEOC charge that has the basis of harassment discrimination on the basis of gender identity. Next slide. OSHA. OSHA also says that employees that are transgender, including transgender employees, but all employees, should have access to the restrooms that they identify with on the basis of their gender. And again, this is a 2016 guidance that came out. And prior to that, they had actually interviewed about 700,000 transgender employees who said that 22% of them were denied use of the restroom of the gender that they identified with by their workplaces. I have had employers contact me what to do when other employees ridicule an employee who is going to use the restroom of the gender they identify with, and even managers who will call the employees out. And of course, you would handle that just like you handle the employee if they were being ridiculed on the basis of their race or their gender or their national origin. It's the same exact thing. OSHA says the best case scenario is single occupancy gender neutral. And I think that's fine for employers who are starting ground up and building their own workplace, but not all employers can do that. And so you don't really have to change anything in your workplace to comply with this to the extent that it's not already being complied with. You just have a male and female restroom, they're side by side, and you make sure that the employee knows that they can use the restroom that they identify with, and you make sure that you're really paying a lot of attention to what's being said and going on around that employee. Most folks are careful not to say it to the HR directors and the HR managers, and so you're going to have to check in with the employee, not overly so, but and then check in around and talk to the manager. I would talk affirmatively to managers and alert them to it so that they know how to deal with it. The other thing is, if you are going to assign a separate space for you'll have male, female, and some have unisex. As long as the unisex restroom does not require the employees to walk any further than they would have to go to the male or female restroom, it's fine. So in some situations where employers gave employees the opportunity to use a unisex restroom that was on the lower level or a higher level of a floor, but all the other restrooms were closer to the workspace, it was determined that that violated Title VII. Next slide. So then OFCCP, if you are a federal contractor, simply that means do you get federal monies for anything you do? Then again, you have affirmative action duties in regards to anyone that falls into these categories. And so that's you're going to need to comply with all of the same requirements of the executive order that's applicable to females and minorities in regards to anyone that falls into the sexual orientation, non-binary or gender identity group. So you need to make sure you're updating all of your affirmative action programs and that your tagline is addressing these categories in your job advertisements, as well as all of your contracts with the government. And we could spend hours on what you need to do if you're a federal contractor. So I will not get down that rabbit hole today. Next slide. Pronoun use. That's another thing that absolutely has to happen. It has to be honored. I'm sorry, I'm setting my time. I'm paying attention. I'm trying not to get too much into Jamie's time. And there is a case that specifically said failure to use the correct pronoun is going to amount to potential harassment under Title VII. A single innocent isolated failure to use the correct pronoun will not amount to harassment under Title VII. That's the same law that applies to other harassment. Single isolated incidents of comments typically do not create a so severe or pervasive of a hostile work environment so as to reasonably intimidate the employee, right? That's the standard. That's going to also be true of a single innocent misuse of the appropriate pronoun. But instead, if we are dealing with a situation where an employee is chastised or joked about it and they won't use it, that's going to tide over into what is considered harassment in violation of Title VII. Next slide. Name change. The IRS and also Social Security Administrator have some rules about that, but it's important that you change the employee's W-2 form to match the Social Security card. And those records can be changed when the employee's completed a name change. So you can also put a note on your internal records for the preferred name prior to any name change. And I think that's important because I think, as we'll hear more from Jamie, sometimes this is a process and it takes a while for there to actually be a legal name change that trickles all the way down to Social Security and IRS. Next slide. Healthcare plans. Important for you to talk to your brokers about your healthcare plan. If you're self-insured, make sure you're checking your stop loss plan, but you want to make sure that your plan is not excluding certain transgender related health services in the terms of the plan. You want to make sure that the plan administration also isn't going to be done in a way that would automatically deny, for instance, cosmetic surgery that might be part of the transitioning process that otherwise would be covered. Review your healthcare plan, talk to your brokers, talk to your insurance carrier, and make sure that this is something that they've taken into consideration, because as you know, you'll always be held liable for what your healthcare plan says, which is also why you need to have a good indemnification provision in it with your brokers and your health carrier. Next slide. And then FMLA parental leave. Keep this in mind. Someone has a son or daughter, it doesn't matter what gender, it doesn't matter if it's same sex, you've got to make sure that they're entitled to the same benefits as everyone else. Transitioning also may qualify as serious health condition at certain times of the transition, so it's important to honor FMLA in regards to that. Next slide. All right, then look at your dress code, your parental leave, sex-specific jobs and opportunities if you have any. Look at these documents, look at your EEOC policy, and look at your benefits and healthcare plans generally in the context of sexual orientation and particularly gender identity. All right, next slide. Now it is my pleasure, and I know I rushed through that, but it's 12:24, and you guys know most of this stuff that I rattled through with you. Let's hear from Jamie. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. And what a great job you did with that. And the thing that really came to mind was many of those points. We could spend an hour just talking about a number of those slides that you had up there without a problem. One of the first things I like to do in all my presentations is acknowledge that I spent the first 60 years of my life definitely with white male privilege. And as a result of that did have a very positive effect on my career, and that it didn't take long for me to experience the other side of it. I was just telling Chris a little while ago that if you attended the webinar in April on women in the workforce, they did a fantastic job of outlining the aggressions and microaggressions that women in particular receive in the workplace. And it confirmed something that I had learned during my transition, was that it wasn't so much that I had transitioned that I was getting this change that I saw, but rather that they were accepting me as female. And I was receiving the same aggressions and microaggressions that women had experienced their whole careers in the workplace. So just to start things off, I'd like to acknowledge that. If we can move on to the next slide. So these are the organizations, we already mentioned them. Let's go skip through that. We can talk more. I want to start off talking a little bit about the science of gender and sexuality, mainly to help you understand the complexity of the issue. It's not black and white. Next slide. This first slide is from the 2017 issue of Scientific American. They did a great job. It was an issue dedicated to sexuality and gender. This particular slide, I don't expect you to be able to read it here, but what it does is shows you the complexity of just genetic aspects that are going on with not just with the X and Y genes. We know now that it goes across many other genes that come into play. There's an awful lot of exogenic issues that come in that were various hormones in the body and other external influences will have an effect on how things come out. There are some anthropologists that will sit there and will tell you there's up to 34 different genders. And there's many, many societies that will have 5 to 10 definitions of different genders within theirs. So it's not something this is brand new. This is something that's always been there. It's deeply embedded into our genetic processes. Next slide. There's a concept that I want you to think about. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right this second, but the concept is being in a place of creative indifference. It comes from the Gestalt paradoxical theory of change from Gestalt psychology. And what it boils down to is looking at polarity, seeing two ends of any issue that could have polar differences, and to not put valence on either end of those polarities, and to begin to open yourself up to see the middle. Next slide. So when we talk about gender and sexuality, we know that there are multiple continuums that are in play. We break them down into three basic ones: a continuum for gender, a continuum for sexuality, and a continuum for physical attributes. Now, so why do we have it down in three? Because they really are three different things. They are affected by various aspects of the brain and brain development and body development, and they occur at different times in the process of development. When we look at gender, we break that down into two. We have gender identity and gender expression. So an awful lot of what we were talking about in the legal aspects of it can deal with either one of those two. I identified my whole life. I didn't publicly identify that way, but I identified internally. So your identity is your brain function. It's what you think where you fall into this continuum. The expression is how you put yourself out there into the world. And many of us will express in a way that we don't necessarily want to, but have to. And as we begin to change that expression, it can change the way you're treated in society. So some of the terms that we have right now, and by the way, there are some overarching terms that we use, like cisgender, which is for those people who accept themselves for how they were assigned at birth. There's transgender, those people who feel they need to make a change from how they were assigned at birth. Gender expansive, which really opens up to all aspects within the polarities, particularly on the gender square continuum. And then you have queer. And queer is a word that's been reappropriated by the gay community. It covers everybody that's in there, and many of us particularly people at my age, struggle with that word. But it is one that many folks are including within how they identify themselves, both on the gender expression, the gender continuums and the sexuality continuums. So getting back to the gender ones, we will see then in the middle, we have the non-binary, we have the gender queer, we have people who are questioning and how they present, could be androgynous or fluid, or at either end, depending on the scenario that they're in. I think it's important to mention, because as we talked about, even the laws very frequently are dealing with the heterosexual and heteronormative processes, and still are looking more at the polarities than they are at the middle. More and more, especially with the young folks, are identifying themselves in the middle, both on the gender standpoint and on the sexuality standpoint. When you're dealing with that bathroom issue, that becomes a third problem. It's not only who should be able to use the men's bathroom, who should be able to use the women's bathroom, but what do you do about these people who don't identify either way? And it's a struggle. So it's a struggle for them as individuals. It's a struggle for organizations. It's how do we deal with those other than just having the gender neutral bathrooms. And there are some organizations that have gone as far as making every single bathroom gender neutral, regardless of what it was originally intended to be. Then there were others that will have, one person lockable bathroom that anybody can use, and that is a very safe way of going about it. When we look at the sexuality continuum, we break that down again into two more. There is the physical sexuality, and there is the emotional or romantic sexuality. In the last week, I've had people come up and either email me or identify me at some tables I've been working at some events lately, and they identify as asexual, lesbian romantic, or asexual biromantic, or bisexual lesbian romantic, more or less, and bisexual and lean more towards the lesbian side. So people are getting, and there again, this tends to be the younger ones, are becoming more and more attuned to finding themselves in various places on these continuums. We're not just women, we're not just men, we're something in between. The terms that show up, of course, for women who are attracted primarily to women, either romantically or physically, or is lesbian. Gay tends to be for men who are attracted primarily to men. And then there's that whole question. I had an interesting conversation last night with a parent, and it was two parents and their child was there, and they were having a discussion between whether or not somebody should be identifying as bisexual or pansexual, and that pansexual was better. Well, as recently as 5 years ago, bisexual was a term that was used primarily for those people who were being attracted and romantically associated with the polarities. And pansexual was everybody and anything in between. Those are blending now. And so you never really know. So the big thing about all of this is you never know without asking or without them just being willing to tell you. And we all know that in the workplace, asking somebody about their sexuality really isn't something that's appropriate to do unless it comes up for them. Physical attributes, we have female, we have male, we have intersex, and we realize now that much more of the population are in the intersex scenario than before. Before, we always heard about people who were intersex that were the extremes. They were born with both sets of organs. They were born with one set of organs, but everything else in the body was the opposite. So that's all changing, and our understanding of that is changing more. Let's move on so we can. We'll talk just a little bit about pronouns. Biggest thing is if you don't know somebody's personal pronouns, and the term is personal pronouns, not preferred pronouns. If you don't know their personal programs, don't assume, just ask. And it should start to become habit. And a lot of organizations have gone ahead and adopted the like on their emails, that people put their personal pronouns wrapped up within their emails, and which is a great thing to do. The other thing I want to say on this is that whenever possible, use gender neutral phrases and labels. When you're talking to groups, instead of saying ladies and gentlemen, you say colleagues. And when you're talking to a class, you say students instead of boys and girls. When you're, in all those types of cases, and if you don't know somebody's gender, use they, them pronouns when you're not sure. That's a safe way of doing it on a neutral basis. If you want to learn a whole lot more about this, the University of Maryland has done a fantastic job on their website, and it's open to everybody can look at it in describing and work that they've done on pronouns and language in the workplace. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience, and I'll do it quickly so that we can jump into some things that's more wrapped up around around questions that you may have. Next. So to start off with, I want you all to know that I always knew who I was, and then at age 4, I found out that I was different than what was expected of me to be. And that in order to survive, in order to be able to be accepted within my family, at that young age, I knew I had to hide my core self. And it wasn't until later in life that I understood some language wrapped up around that. And when I talked to psych students and counseling students and the medical students, I talk a whole lot more about that. But it's there. It was embedded, and I knew it. And I spent all my childhood hiding like crazy. The first person who ever knew my secret was Karen, who's my wife now. And Karen and I have been married. We're coming up in 2 weeks. We'll be married, or 6 days, I guess, 48 years. And we're only, by the way, part of 7.5% of couples who, at the point in time, if they're married at the point in time that they transition, that marriage survives. And we met at Bowling Green, and it was our secret. I learned later the intimacy of that secret and how important it was as a function of our marriage. Move forward, please. Some of the other things that's important to just realize, and we'll just go over this, but there's been so much, we're all aware of the legislation that's going on, particularly around anti-transgender laws, and it's very, very noticeable by the youth. A recent report noted that 25% of LGBTQ youth, and this was in 2021, attempted suicide due to these bills, and they didn't even have to live in the states that the bills were introduced in. It's become such general knowledge. That's the psychological effect that it has on, and it has psychological effect on anxiety and depression for all of us. And as comfortable and as out there as I am, it has effects on me. And just to keep seeing it over and over and over again. Transgender kids face higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. Suicide rates in the transgender community range, depending on the studies that you've seen, from 41.5% of kids having, or transgender people of all ages, having suicide ideations, up to 98% of transgender people having suicide ideations. And 1 in 3 in 2019 transgender kids reported they attempted suicide. That is exceedingly higher than the general population. And it's because primarily of family rejection and social rejection that creates that. Next slide. So, as I moved on and, excuse me, got into working, it became a lot easier for me to hide behind my success. I was still hiding, I was still practicing it at home, but it was behind locked doors. And, excuse me. Anyway, So while it was easier for me to hide behind success, food and alcohol became more important in my life. And food had always been an important way for me to deaden the pain. And but it really became very, very noticeable later on in life. It's important that to note it that in 1985, I was officially diagnosed with a gender disorder. When I went to the Gestalt Institute, it required 52 hours of therapy. And in doing that therapy, the very first thing they did was the MMPI, which is a tool used by psychologists to determine whether or not somebody has disorders. And it apparently glowed in that. And Karen and I used a big chunk of that 52 hours doing couples therapy. And what was interesting is that the gender issue wasn't what we had to deal with. It was a whole lot of other stuff within a marriage that we did. It was very helpful for us. It wasn't until 2013 that the gender identity disorder was removed from the DSM and replaced with the gender dysphoria. I want to emphasize how strong that gender dysphoria is and the effect that it has on those people who are working with you. And so when we talk about the use of pronouns, when we talk about the use of language within our workplace, that and women, you all have been dealing with an awful lot of this for your careers, but it really does translate very strongly to people who are transgender. And it doesn't make any difference if they are female to male or male to female. That dysphoria is strong, and it can become overwhelming, especially early in the process when people are misgendering, and especially when they're when they use the wrong pronouns. And sometimes when it's intentional, and so it is something that you deal with. For me, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but I ended up having huge weight issues. I also ended up with an addiction with alcohol, and which actually was supported by work. Some people would say I drank for a living. And well, you go to a meeting with hedge fund managers, they're smooching you, trying to get you to buy into their hedge fund, and they ply you with alcohol like crazy. But anyway, I did find my passion in advocacy that helped me lead to my transition. And earlier in the process, I called it micro-transitioning. I went towards, next slide, please, went towards androgyny. This kind of shows a progression. I won't talk a whole lot about it, but you can see that as time went on. One noted thing is in 2009, I had cancer, and at that point in time, I really decided it was time for me to stop hiding as much. And I was actually kind of playing with androgyny to see if that would be enough. In 2013, Karen looked at me one day and said, "It's time, isn't it?" And together we made the decision for me to make the transition and to go public, because I was being correctly gendered more and more when we were out in public. And if I was with a group of women, it would be all ladies, and they didn't recognize that there was a man with them in that scenario. So it was time. Next slide, please. So going into full-time transitioning affects every single system that you're a part of. Somebody who is transitioning, it's different than, this is the one place where it's a little bit different from the rest of the LGBTQ community. Because when you transition, you are literally changing all aspects of your life, and how you're presenting yourself to the world. And so for me, that started in 2013 around Thanksgiving. Started telling family. It also was a time when I started to do the work stuff at work actually a little bit before that, I had been had been telling a few girlfriends that I worked closely with, who were people that were in the same group of folks that I traveled with all the time, and just conversations would come up and I would let it slip out. And but in December of 2013 is when I went to our, well, actually in October of 13, I had met with a good friend of mine who was the director of employee relations, and who happened to be gay. And then he and I had conversations wrapped up around the possibility. He just says, it's going to be up to you, because we have absolutely no idea what to do. And so then, so in December, I kind of kicked it off with our director of diversity, and so I'm in the restroom and looked and said, we need a gender neutral bathroom in this facility. The only one that was on our campus was in another building. And so yeah, that's a really good idea. We happened to, at that point in time, been doing some construction on remodeling on all of our floors. So as we walked out, I said, let me tell you why we need one. And so that was my official announcement to the company that that I was coming out. And he immediately took it to our president, who had to approve any kind of changes like that. And within 2 weeks, because we were in the construction process, within 2 weeks they had identified a bathroom, and that I was going to be doing it. What was important, though, for me as an individual, and for anybody in your organizations who decides that they're going to transition, is that they need a support team. And it needs to be a support team of people who literally, truly are going to support them through the process. And to the extent possible, allow them to define how the timing is going to be laid out with everything. When I came out, and Michelin did a great job with me on this, and I was in a position that had a very, very high visibility. And so we put together, not only did I have my own little support team that I had already pulled together, but we put together an official support team that included some people from personnel, also included two, they were my friends, but they included two people that were part of employee communication. Because of the role that I was in, this was going to have to be something that was going to have to be announced. And it was going to have to be announced globally, literally globally. And so with their help, we put together a communication plan and a timing plan. And we decided that it was early in January of 14 that we were going to make the announcement. And on the day that we did, 25,000 people were informed, either through the 400 emails that I had to send out, not only to people within Michelin, but also to the folks that I managed, my vendors that I managed, that were running our pension plans and so it was y'all know who I'm talking about. It was our plan administrators, it was our actuaries, it was our bank, our trustees, and all of whom I worked very, very closely with, and worked very closely with their teams that were doing the work for me. So with all that going on, that was a big group of people that had to be done internally within Michelin. It went to the communication process. And so all the managers had to let people know this was happening. And 15 minutes prior to my email going out, our vice president sent an email to all the internal communication team saying, here's our policy and here's what's expected. And so it went very, very well. Of the 400 that I sent in, I got 160 within a few hours. I got 160 responses back that were very positive. And I had I knew that the communication part was working, because then all of a sudden a lot of folks, all women, came down and gave me hugs and said it was great. The men would walk by and not even look in my direction. That was the beginning of the bit. if you need to know more about what's required, for doing a transitioning from the medical side, there's an organization called WPATH. It's the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. They create the standards of care that are accepted worldwide on for what is necessary in order for doing a transition and supporting transition from that side. Because doing this requires a team. It requires counseling. In order to even be able to start hormone therapy, you have to have had counseling for a period of time, and you have to have had a letter from a psychiatrist saying that you don't have any disorders. So it requires not only your counselor, but you also have to have a letter of, now these are changing, but that when I was going through, that was required. And for the most part, most medical professionals will still require these things. You have medical, which tends to be endocrinologists or primary care physicians who are skilled in doing the work, providing hormones and hormone blockers as are necessary. It can require surgical interventions. For those of us who are thinking more of the polarities, it would definitely require surgical interventions. And then another big thing is wrapped up around the voice. And there are surgeries that can be done for the voice, but for most of us, we will use speech pathologists to work on. There's 9 aspects of speech that have to be modified to move from a masculine voice to a more feminine voice. And for those folks who are moving from female to male, a lot of times they had already adapted a lot of the male mannerisms in their voice prior to it. But when they go on hormones, different from going from male to female, when they go on hormones, within about 6 weeks to 8 weeks, their voice starts to drop. And they get a lower pitch. It doesn't happen the other way around. I'm still working. I do all this advocacy work, and I still have to do a lot. Just yesterday here in Greenville, we're going to have to fight a battle with the libraries that wants to remove all any information from any of the libraries that's LGBTQ related. And so there's still medical issues that need to be done. I work with medical schools and with counseling schools in order to help those coming up in the system at least have some baselines to work from and to know where to go for more work. There's still a lot of legal issues that can come in. I've got rid of, just a month or two ago, one of the last legal issues I had to deal with was the deed on our house. And to get that in the right name, because the court order that I had for name change didn't work for a deed. And as I was told. So I finally got out and hired the lawyer to do it. I went through a lot of issues with the DMV. There are less issues now because at that point in time, there were a few of us that were arguing with them, and we got some major change done. Next slide, please. So I completed my transition. I have this slide as much as anything else for the medical students and for the counselors, but what really blew my mind was at 6 months was the effect of hormones already on skin and fat redistribution. And because that's what's happening in the cheeks and stuff like that. And I had surgery, and the best thing that ever happened for me. For the first time in my life at that point in time, I felt like my brain and my body were congruent, and it was fantastic. Last slide. We can go to any questions you may have. You're muted, Christine.
Yes, thank you. While I'm looking through to see if there's questions, I do want you to know that several folks have said that, let me read it. First of all, welcome to the sisterhood. We're happy to have you. In regards to your comments about, being female, gender, women. Always appreciating this great information. Linda Lewis said, this is amazing, informative, and an awesome guide for how to proceed in this ever-changing world. And so I thank you for that, because I knew that you would be sharing things that a lot of folks hadn't heard before and wouldn't feel comfortable asking their employees. But I have a couple of questions while we're waiting to see if other folks have questions. What would you advise an employer to look at in regards to their healthcare plan, especially since that was the area that you worked in?
Yeah. So it's actually it's all policies, but in your healthcare plans are part of all the other policies that have to be laid out. So the things you need to look at specifically are what exclusions do you have in there that exclude treatment. And there,
I'm writing it down.
well, I'm trying to think of a way of saying this. There's always people in the insurance aspect and in the self-insured aspect that think it's okay to discriminate against certain populations, and that there's healthcare plans discriminate against different groups, so it doesn't make any difference. You can discriminate against these folks in healthcare plans, and that's just not true. And you really can't. And so it's look at it, make sure you don't have the exclusions in there that go away from it. But then more specifically, you could even do something to make it more clear as to what your intentions are by ensuring that you have some language in there wrapped up around what you are going to be willing to cover. And so there, you know, from the psychological side, from the mental health side, quite frankly, I never had any issues on that part of it, but there's therapy, and therapy needs to continue on for longer periods of time. It was my therapist that helped me deal with, so this 6 months after the fact, it helped me deal with the misgendering and things like that, about getting in touch with my own anger issues wrapped up around that, and how to work myself through so that I didn't escalate the issue that was myself, didn't escalate the issue. And quite frankly, it was to look at them with that are you kidding look, and just not say anything in my head, saying that I was feeling sorry for them for not being able to see who they were talking to. Yeah. And because even at that point in time, there was no question. So looking at all those, what will you cover, or will you be able to have to cover anything wrapped up around the voice? What will you do from a surgical standpoint? And it should be clear that from a surgical standpoint, that somebody going from female to male will frequently want to have top surgery done, and some may want to have what we call generally labeled as bottom surgery, and there may or may not be any other kind of alterations to the face. On a male to female standpoint, there are definitely surgical procedures that a lot of people will want to have. Bottom surgery is definitely one of them. Top surgery is definitely one of them, and facial surgery is important. Just one little thing you might never know, but women tend to have a shorter space between their upper lip and their nose, and one of the surgeries is trimming up here and pulling that up and shortening that space. Oh. And wow. So that's one of there's lots of different procedures that can go on for face feminization. So within your medical plans is to have that, but the biggest thing is to get rid of the exclusion.
Yeah. Okay. So that's helpful. Another question. What was the one thing that your employer did that helped you feel supported?
Oh, right from the beginning, number one, just getting the bathroom put in made me feel extremely supported. You got to remember that I had worked with this organization I had known a lot of the people that I had worked with. A lot of them had come with me had started at BF Goodrich, where I started off, and had come with me through Uniroyal Goodrich, and we had known each other. Like the person I talked to, or I had known him since 1981, and I had known of him. We had met probably in '79, and I had known these people for years and years, and so I was very cognizant of that and wanted to be sure that I didn't overstep anything. So that's why I wanted a gender neutral bathroom, and I made up my own mind that I wasn't going to try to use the other bathrooms until after I had the surgeries. That's not true for a lot of other folks. A lot of other folks will want to be able to do those immediately. So we need to accommodate people to the extent that they need to be accommodated.
Right. That's an interesting point. And it's interesting to me too, that that's the one I get the most questions about. And then to hear that from you, that's where you felt the most supported. So we have another question. What was your cumulative feeling experience surrounding your life in white male privilege world compared to your world as a female moving forward? And for those of you who have to leave, thank you for coming so much. We appreciate it. Understand you've got schedules. Definitely we're staying on as long as the questions are coming, as long as that's okay with Jamie.
Yeah.
So I'll say it again. What was your cumulative feeling or / experience surrounding your life in the white male privilege world compared to your world as a female moving forward?
So a few years ago, I was speaking to a class, family counseling class at Converse College, and the professor asked me the question, this beautiful Black woman who just, and the questions had been going on for a long time. What normally was an hour-and-a-half process, we'd already gotten up to, went 2.5 hours. And anyway, so she was asking one of the last questions, and she looked at me and she said, did I feel shame for having had white male privilege, having had the privileges that I had? And it was the first question I had to pause on. And I looked at her and I said, and she had this real glint in her eye. And I said, no, I didn't feel shame for having had the privilege. What I felt was shame for not knowing that I had the privilege. So my accumulation of feelings wrapped up around having had it was that I wasn't aware of it. And I would have argued with anybody telling me that I had privilege, because I knew how hard I was working and how hard I struggled to get to where I did. Now, we know now about the stigmatization that goes on and the implicit biases that we all have. So I was a person of size, so there was stuff wrapped up around that. I was a person who didn't always dress exactly conforming. Earlier in my career, I really did, but later on, I didn't. So there was stuff wrapped up around that. But in general, it was I realize now how much advantage that I did have, but I did not know it at the time. And the one thing though, there was always a piece that I never understood. There was I had one performance review told me I wasn't. Well, no, I can't think of the word. It was just in my head, and I didn't know. It totally lost it. But basically, it said I wasn't aggressive enough, and and that.
Is this when you were still
ambitious? Ambitious was the word. I wasn't ambitious enough.
Was this when you were still presenting as male?
Oh yeah.
Exactly. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And this was back in the late 80s. And yeah, so it was that was probably one of the things that kept me from, because I wouldn't do a lot of things and didn't understand a lot of things that a lot of my male counterparts had done. And I had early in life, I had tried to be more macho, and it didn't work for me. So I just quit doing that stuff. And so there was a balance that came into play.
That's interesting. All right, so there's another question. Are there more issues when assisting someone who chooses not to receive bottom surgery, but chooses top surgery? I would want everyone to live with their truth, and I'm curious if insurance companies ever retaliate for not fully transitioning.
I have no idea about the insurance companies on that. Most of us couldn't even afford the copays and stuff that are necessary to do everything all at once. So I was a rarity. I had some resources, and even though it wasn't going to get paid for at that point in time by the company, and but I did have the resources, and I had all my surgeries in 2 days. But but most people don't. It is more of an issue for folks. They continue on with stronger dysphoria issues for those that eventually want to have bottom surgery but can't afford to do it. And so there's always more of a struggle. I had folks that had the capability of getting it and kept putting it off because they weren't ready themselves. And that's what they need to do. But that's why it's important for counseling to be part of the process, because counselors will help them through that, particularly those that have expertise in working with our community, and that's one of the reasons I spend a lot of time talking to counselors. And with 864 Pride, work with a lot of counselors, and so it's a struggle, but more than anything else, and for those people who are in the middle, they may never have any kind of surgery. Now, where the biggest issues occur are on the legal side of it, on the other part of the employment process, which is when changing your name. Changing your name is one thing. Changing your gender is another. And depending on the state, depending on what agency you're working with, there's going to be different requirements. So when it comes to the federal government, you need to have been on hormone therapy for a while at least hormone therapy for a while before they'll let you change your gender. So with me, when I changed to Social Security, it was about 6 months after the fact. I had been on hormones long enough. I had a letter. So when we went down, I got my court order and my letter from my physician. So with Social Security, I was able to change my gender and my name right then and there. And it was a fairly quick process, as long as you had those documents. And having those documents is what the key is. So it's a letter from your counselor, a letter from the psychiatrist, and a letter from stating that you've had, from a medical physician saying that you've had medical treatment for it. And once I changed it there, then my employer could change my name in payroll systems and all their systems. It also then changed it in my name and my gender in all the insurance.
So that's interesting. But you hadn't had the surgery by that time.
I hadn't had the surgery, but I had hormone therapy. Now the state, before I could change it on my driver's license, required the surgery.
Really?
Yeah, and to have it changed on my birth certificate required the surgery, and that was in the state of Virginia. But those rules vary by state.
Yeah.
And so if any of you all have employees across the nation, then it's going to be a little bit different for each of them. It's always going to be a struggle.
Right.
And then any of you who've had name changes for whatever, if you get married, all the stuff wrapped up around that. And when it comes to that sort of name change, even getting my name changed on credit cards and on stuff required all kinds of documentation.
Yeah, sure. That sounds exhausting. So another question. With healthcare plans, there are many things that if they are pre-existing, they are not covered. How do you get past the pre-existing aspect? And will this not also make the premium cost rise due to the cost of the surgeries needed opted for?
Okay, so pre-existing stamp issues really are more of an issue when it comes to insured plans as opposed to self-insured plans. If you're self-insured plan and you're under ERISA, you can get rid of that pre-existing condition for this, or you can say that this is not a pre-existing, that doesn't fall under these rules. So I mean, you make up the rules, and that's the most important thing about an ERISA plan, is to realize that it's you making the rules, not the insurance company. Not they can make recommendations to you, but it is you that are making the rules. And so if it's an insured plan, then I haven't heard of this coming up as a pre-existing condition being used as an excuse not to cover it. Mainly because most of them just have flat out exclusions for it.
So they affirmatively exclude any
yeah, right.
All right. Well, that's the extent of the questions. And I will tell you, everyone, on the last slide, Jamie and I have cobbled together some resources for you that will help, in the employment aspect, the law aspect, as well as the supporting your employee aspect. But I will tell you, Jamie, there are quotes and comments through the chat of how appreciative everybody is of sharing your journey.
Thank you.
Them.
Thank you.
And I am as well. We all are. And I think this could be a long conversation where we could learn from you more and more. I know we barely tapped the basis of your knowledge. Last comment is from Steve Nell saying,
"Hey, Steve."
Oh yeah, everybody.
We work together.
Everybody, great guy, and love what he said, that he hopes you're well and happy. And so, one more question from India Underwood. She's HR director at Safe Harbor. If we have a new hire starting as trans and their paperwork, background checks, new hire forms, insurance are completed as their transgender, I'm assuming she means name, do we need to ask any questions, or do we just submit it all without questions? That's sort of a legal / what do you think? New hire paperwork. And I think India, do you mean they've already transitioned? They're already using their name and pronoun of choice, regardless of whether they're actually physically transitioning. If so, then do it all that way. Yes, with their new, yes, she's saying that's it. But as far as the healthcare plan, I think you have to be careful, because if this is someone who, right, so you go ahead, Jamie, you know that better than me. Why don't you answer that bit?
Yeah, so you're going to have two scenarios. You're going to have somebody who has truly fully transitioned and has all their legal documentation in place. So if their driver's license and their passport, by the way, the passport, as soon as I got Social Security done, I was able to get my passport done. And so that was what I traveled on, as opposed to my driver's license. And but if they have all those documents in place, that means they've met all the requirements that are necessary, and you put everything through under their legal standing. But you are required by Social Security that your documentation internally is going to have to match what's on Social Security, both from a tax standpoint and from and all other aspects in Social Security standpoint. And so from that place, that's going to become a delicate conversation. And so it's going to be wrapped up around letting them know, if you can counsel them and say, we have to use your legal name in all these purposes. Now, if you can change your system so that you have place for preferred names and have it within your policies that they can use their preferred name or their personal name on their badges and stuff like that, that would be great. But but from a payroll standpoint, from an insurance standpoint, all that has got to match what's in Social Security.
Right. So, and then even the healthcare plan too, I think in terms of what benefits might be available to someone on the basis of their gender, and if they've not physically transitioned, you've got to be mindful that they're not being denied coverage of things that they should be having physically. Would you agree with that, Jack?
Yeah.
All right. So these are great questions.
Let me say this, that if you have more questions, feel free to either email Chris, or Chris, you're welcome to provide my email address out to everybody, and I will be happy to answer any question that you've got. And if you feel like it's important enough, I'll be happy to do a Zoom call with you or a telephone call with you. This is what I do. This is how I'm spending my retirement, is trying to help others not go through what I did.
Well, Jamie, you're amazing. And I'm so thankful that you joined us today. I'm thankful I know you, and I'm thankful that you're so open and willing to share. And I know everybody that was on today appreciates that as well. And so everyone, thank you for being here. Jamie, especially, thank you for being here. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks for joining this webinar presented by Haynsworth Sinkler Boyd. To learn more about the firm and its services, visit hsblawfirm.com.